The San Antonio Spurs have a record of 22-20, better than most people had expectations for them going into the season. But what if I told you one simple trick could make them so much better, into a contender, maybe even a dynasty? Maybe it's not that simple. The trick is to throw the team back into the 1990s. As crazy of an idea as this may seem, just think about their players and how well they fit into the era. I mean, for many, Demar Derozan has got the label to the closest thing to Jordan today. But just exactly how good could they be? Could they beat the greats of the era, Malone's Jazz, Hakeem's Rockets, and MJ's Bulls? Be sure to stick around, because my conclusion might shock you. Before we start the video, be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA videos like this, and comment down below letting me know what you thought. But with that said, let's get into the video. You might be asking, how'd you come up with such a stupid question like that? So to figure out how we got here, we have to go back to early March, when I was watching a game between them and the Mavericks. They were performing pretty well, and I should have been focusing on the positives, but me being the pessimist I am, I was thinking about this question first lightly before going into a rabbit hole of thoughts about what they would be like. This video is going to be a recap of what I discovered in said rabbit hole, how the players in the team converts, but more importantly, just how much of a difference the era can make. The way I will do this is first by trying to make comparisons for every single one of their players to try and give a better idea of what they would be like, and then go over how well I would think they could do. And spoiler alert, it's pretty good. Quickly, as a side note, I'm going to include Lamarcus Aldridge in this video and just use the rest of the current Spurs roster. I know he's no longer with the team and now trying to build a super team with the Nets, but in the game I was watching he was in, and it just makes the video more fun for me. And with that said, let's talk about him. Lamarcus Aldridge, while he was still on the team, wasn't the player he was in Portland or even a few years ago, but still very solid. He was more or less the same type of player, solid finisher around the rim and a decent three-point shooter. Not a good playmaker, an okay defender, and a pretty good rebounder. Of course, the best part of his game though was his signature mid-range and post-game. In the post, he plays with amazing finesse and control of a player for his frame. He has moves and footwork every aspiring big man should look at, and a soft touch that makes him one of the best mid-range shooters in the game. For his 90s comparison, I'd go Karl Malone. Yes. Don't click off, I have my reasoning. NBA players are just better nowadays in my opinion. From the training and conditioning to the focus on every little detail, players are not only more skilled, but there are more aspiring NBA players, so the bar to get to the NBA in every level of player is far higher than before. But I can't have all my fun. I can't just build the dream team. So let's take into account these differences in the game. A more realistic comparison is an older Kevin McHale. He's the closest match I could find to his various post moves and his overall play style on offense. In addition, he matches his great free throw shooting for a big man, the ability to play the 4 or the 5, neither lack or excess of athleticism, and good rebounding. At the start of their 10-man rotation, getting the least minutes is Devin Vassell. He's one of the many 3-and-D players that have been popping up all over the league in the past few years because of how the game has changed. For Vassell, I'd say his comparison is a young Bruce Bowen. In the 1990s, Bruce Bowen was an undrafted journeyman trying to find his footing in the league. In his first real chance in 1998, he was a great defender, averaging 1.4 steals, and was a pretty okay shooter for the era, similar to Vassell. So far, if the players I'm comparing these players to seems a bit off, it's probably because their comparisons are worse shooters. This is important to realize because I'm not exactly trying to find who they were exactly like, but the role they would play in the 90s. Just keep that in mind for the rest of the video. For Rudy Gay, I'd say a player in the 90s comparable to him is Walt Williams. They're both very solid all-around scorers, good shooters, solid slashers, and the ability to create their own shot, while both being okay defenders. Jakob Poeltl's comparison is boring, so I'll get through it quick. Kelvin Cato, both very efficient scorers on offense or on the rim, get lots of blocks on defense and rebounds, just your run-of-the-mill traditional big man. Derek White's comparison in the era is somebody like Vinnie Johnson, a combo guard with elite level speed. Both of them are very good playmakers and solid defenders as well. While they aren't the best on offense, they are both okay shooters for their respective times and are overall decent on that side. Derek is a better shooter, but like I said with many of these players, that can be expected. Patty Mills is an interesting player to try and find a comparison for, because if you were a role player on the bench shooting 7 threes a game back in the 90s, you'd probably be kicked to the Chinese league. But a pretty close comparison is Mark Price, aka OK Kid according to Basketball Reference, near the end of his career. Both are high volume scorers who get a lot of points created by themselves, taking a high volume of threes. Lonnie Walker is an athletic scorer who shoots lots of threes. I imagine in the 90s he would be similar to Rex Chapman. They're both role players who are volume scorers with athleticism. Another great role player on their roster is Keldon Johnson, and I'd say a close comparison is Sean Elliott, coincidentally from the Spurs as well. They're both very talented spot-up shooters with the ability to defend pretty well, and are both very athletic. Last one, the predecessor to perhaps the most interesting one we have, DeJounte Murray. He's a 6'5" point guard who's an all-defense level defender and a great rebounder for a guard, so who was like that in the 90s? This one was tough, but I think a great way to visualize him in the past is Fat Lever. The main part of both of their games is their defense, with both of them being some of the best defenders in the league at their times. On offense, DeJounte is a bit more polished, but that's another product of the expectations in the NBA currently. Okay, the final one before we get to how good they might perform is Demar Derozan, their best player. As fun as it would be to say, DeMar just isn't MJ. While this sucks, I'm pretty sure he'd be happy enough to be compared to Clyde the Glide though. It's funny just how much is similar between them if you compare DeMar now and Drexler when he was aging, and nobody really talks about it. They both are obviously physical freaks, both some of the best slashers of their era, and when it comes to shooting, they're both some of the best mid-range shooters in the game, but not good at shooting threes. And the reason I'm comparing an older Drexler is because as they age, they both polish their offensive bag, relying less on raw athleticism and more on footwork, touch, and post moves. While Clyde has him beat on defensive, this is about as close as I think you can get on offense. In addition, the Spurs are coached by Greg Popovich. He runs a system that is very defensive-oriented and shoots very little threes, basically the same as every single team in the 90s. This can make the team much better because some of the players on the Spurs right now, you can tell are being held back by the system because they're not told to shoot as many threes. It goes against what they normally do on other teams, and it's one of the most unique offensive systems in the league, which is hard for many players to adjust to. But when these players' skill sets are adjusted for the 90s, they fit far better. Finally, we can get on to how they would work. As I talk about this, try and take into account how the game changes, and not from a current perspective. So how do I think they could do? For one, I think this would be a very hard case for teams to try and guard on offense due to their spacing. Just off a quick thought, I can't think of any team in the 90s that would be a better shooting team. And with the inability to play zone defenses and basically just having to play straight up man, the Spurs would get a lot of easy shots because the defense just doesn't know what to do. Okay, but what years would they be the best and maybe even win a championship? If I'm being honest with myself, I think they could have won multiple championships if they were placed into the 90s. In the second year, I think they could have won 1990 to 1991. That year, the champions were the Bulls when MJ won his first ring. That team was basically near prime MJ, a still developing Scottie Pippen, and nobody really after that. In addition, the Spurs match up well too. DeJounte's a pretty alright matchup for Jordan, who's most of their offense. The rest of the league wasn't anything special either, with the next best team being a slightly worse Bad Boy Pistons, Clyde Drexler's Blazers, and a Walmart Showtime Lakers, so I think they could have won that year. Another year I think they could have been champions is 1995. The champions that year were the Houston Rockets, who were led by Hakeem Olajuwon. After that, their best player was an old Clyde Drexler, and then they don't really have anyone all that great after that. And I understand it would be a ginormous mismatch with Jakob Poeltl being on Hakeem, but with all the depth the Spurs have, I think they could beat them. The rest of the West was good also, having the Spurs, Jazz, and Suns as very good teams, but these teams are all worse than the Rockets and match up pretty similarly. And if I think they could get out of the West, I'm pretty sure they'd win the whole thing, as the finals opponent would be a young Shaq and Penny Magic, who I can definitely see them beating. But this is where I can confidently say that their championships end. I know teams can't keep together cores for a decade, but keep in mind, these are only ones I'm pretty confident they could win, so 2 rings is pretty realistic in my opinion. If you look at other years like 1994 or the last few years of the 90s, they were also pretty easy. So yeah, if the San Antonio Spurs played in the 90s, they could have gone from a borderline playoff team to winning 2 rings. If this seems crazy, just think of it like this. Fat Lever, Clyde Drexler, Sean Elliott, Kevin McHale, and Kelvin Cato, along with a deep bench, shooting like the era had never before seen, and arguably the greatest coach of all time. When you think of things like this, it's just amazing how much the game has changed in simply a third of a century. The Spurs would be pretty awesome in the 1990s. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.